Hey, soldier, welcome to Pocket Ronnie. Sit down, pay attention, and conquer your fear of math.
Okay, now we're going to be doing integer problems, consecutive integers, and consecutive even and odd integers. The first thing you need to know is what is an integer. Okay, integer, if you're not sure, an integer is a whole number, meaning it cannot be a fraction or a decimal. It's a whole number, and it can either be positive or negative. So on all these problems, you should come up with a whole number, not a decimal, not a fraction, a whole number, but it can be positive or negative. That's what an integer is. Alright? So, on this very first problem, 28e, 3 and 4, we want 3 consecutive integers. Okay? So let me stop there. What does consecutive mean? Consecutive means one after the other. So consecutive, if I counted consecutive numbers, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so forth, one right after the other. How did I get to each number? I added 1. So we don't know what our 3 consecutive integers are, so we're going to label this that our first integer is n. Okay? Then our second one, we only want 3, so we're going to first 1, 2, and 3, our third integers. So if I have consecutive integers, how did I get to the next number? I add 1. I add 1 every time. So if my first integer is n, because I don't know what n represents, we're going to calculate it and find out. So my first integer is n. How do I get to the next one, my second integer? I take my n plus 1. How did I get to my third integer? I add another 1. So if I added 1, if I took I add 1 each time. So if I took and added 1 to that, now I would be at n plus 2. And if I kept going on, n plus 3, n plus 4, and so on. Because if you start here, I add 1. Now I'm adding 2 to that original number. Now I'm adding 3 to the original number, starting with this, and so forth. So if you just add 1 every time, add 1. Now if I add 1 more, I'm at 2, because 1 plus 1 is 2. If I added 1 to here, then it'd be n plus 3, and so forth. But since we only want 3 consecutive integers, then our first integer is n. My second integer is n plus 1. My third is n plus 2 because they're consecutive. Now I go back to the problem and I write my equation. So in the problem it says find 3 consecutive integers such that 7 times the first. How do I say 7 times the first? 7 times I use parentheses, the first. What is my first integer? Right here I have it labeled, n. So 7 times the first integer plus 2 times, because parentheses tells me times, the second integer. What is my second integer? N plus 1. Equals, so I'm literally going word for word. 6 times the third integer, my third integer, right here. N plus 2 plus 8. So I literally just took word for word and then turned it into an equation. Okay? Now I only have one unknown, so I only have one equation, and I can solve for n. Okay, here, 7n, so I'm just going to write 7n. What do I do with this? Distribute it, plus 2n plus 2 equals, what do I do with my 6? Distribute it, 6n plus 12 plus 8. I'm only distributing that 6 to this parentheses, not to this 8. Now it's just a matter of combining n's and whole numbers. 7n plus 2n, 9n. No n's to combine over here, so 6n can combine my whole numbers, plus 20. Get your n's on one side, numbers on the other side. So I'm going to subtract 6n from both sides. So that would be 3n plus 2 equals 20. Subtract 2 from both sides. 3n equals 18. Divide both sides by 3. n equals 6. Remember, we should come up with an integer, a whole number. It can be negative or positive. I'm not done. When you get to this point, don't stop, because the problem didn't ask me what is n. The problem asked me find the first 3 consecutive integers. So n, what did n represent? N represented my first integer. So my first integer is 6. I need 3 of those, 3 consecutive integers. What's my next one? How do I get to my next integer? Add 1, 7. How do I get to my next one? Add 1, because they need to be consecutive. So my 3 consecutive integers are 6, 7, 8. That's my answer. Don't box this. That just tells you where to start. Okay, we're at 28E, 5 and 6. This says find 3 consecutive even integers. I'm going to stop right there. I recommend you underline the word even. Okay, remember integers, whole numbers, and they can be positive or negative. What's an even, consecutive even integers? Well, if I'm counting 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, those are even. Even if I don't want to use 0. So I have 2, 4, 6, 8. So let's just eliminate 0 for a second. They are consecutive, 2, 4, 6, 8, and they're all even. Okay, I'm counting consecutive even integers. How did I get to the next one? I added 2 every time. Okay, so for even integers, you are adding 2 every time. So if I want to call my first integer n, I still call my first one n because it's an unknown number. I don't know what the number is. So I'm going to call it n. So then my second integer, if I want to be consecutive, I'm just adding 2. To go for even numbers, I have to add 2 each time. So, and that's what I did up here. To go from 2 to 4, I added 2. To go from 4 to 6, I added 2. I'm adding 2 every time. So then for my third integer, I'm going to add 2 every time. So if I took n plus 2 and added 2, now I have n plus 4. So then my third integer would be n plus 4. If I want to keep going, my fourth integer would be n plus 6. You're adding 2 to this number every time. You're adding 2. So now that I know these are the values that are going to represent my first, second, and third integer, I can take my words and turn it into equations. So have such that 3 times, so I have 3 times the first integer. Down here my first integer is n minus 7 times the second integer. Okay, what's my second integer? N plus 2. So now second integer equals 2. Okay, now I need to solve. I only have one unknown, n. I need to solve for that. So here I have 3n. Here I need to distribute that negative. This is negative 7. Distribute it to both things. Negative 7 times n, negative 7n. Negative 7 times a positive 2, negative 14. Be sure and distribute that negative to both things. Now I can combine my n's. That would be a negative 4n minus 14 equals 2. Add my 14 to the other side. So negative 4n equals 16. Yeah. Divide both sides by negative 4. And n equals a positive divided by negative is a negative, and 16 divided by 4 is 4. It is okay to have a negative number. A negative number is an integer. Integers are positive, are whole numbers, and they can be positive or negative. So I'm not done here because I wanted 3 consecutive even integers. So my first number is negative 4, and the fact that they are even, I should end up with even numbers. So my first integer is negative 4. How do I get to my next integer? I add 2. Adding 2 to this, negative 4 plus 2 is a negative 2. How do I get to my next one? Add 2. You add 2 every time. Negative 2 plus 2, 0. So those are my 3 consecutive even integers. Okay, now let's look at 28e, 7 and 8. Find 3 consecutive odd integers, okay, odd. So we're going to stop right there. Odd integers, I want consecutive odd integers. If I had odd numbers, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, those are odd. How did I get to the next one? I added 2. I added 2, added 2, added 2. So no matter if it's even or odd, you are still adding 2 every time. So anytime you have a consecutive odd integer and consecutive even integer, your setup will be the same thing. Okay, so my first integer is always going to be n, some unknown number. How did I get to my second integer? I added 2. Because even if it's odd, I'm adding 2. I'm skip counting by 2's, but now I'm with odd numbers. So how do I get to my third integer? I'm adding 2 to this, so that would be n plus 4. Because if I add 2 to that, now I've got 2 plus 2, 4. I'm adding 2 every time. Add 2 to this, add 2 to this, add 2 to this. I'm adding 2 every time. Okay? The difference between when I have, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So find 3 consecutive odd integers such that 5 times the first integer, so 5 times the first integer is n, minus 3 times the third integer. What's my third integer? It's labeled right here, third, n plus 4, equals the second integer. What's my second integer? N plus 2 plus 1. So I could have parentheses or I can take the parentheses away. Either way. 5n. What do I do with this? Distribute it. Distribute that negative. Negative 3 times n, negative 3n. Negative 3n times a positive 4, negative 12. Here, I can just basically take these parentheses away. N plus 2 plus 1. Add your numbers together. N plus 3. On the left, I can combine my n's. 5n minus 3n, 2n. Now I need to get my n's on one side, get my whole numbers on the other side. So I'm going to subtract my n from both sides. So that would be just n. Now I'm going to add my 12. So it turns out n equals 15. I said that I wanted 3 consecutive odd integers. The fact that I wanted odd integers, odd numbers, this should come out to an odd number. 15 is an odd number, okay? That's just my first integer. Now I want the next 2 odd integer. How did I get to my next odd integer? I'm adding 2 every time. So 15 plus 2, 17. Add 2, 19. So my 3 consecutive odd integers, 15, 17, 19. Make sure if it's asking for odd numbers, you do have odd numbers. If they're asking for even, make sure your numbers are even numbers.